Hello there, and welcome to the Science for Sleep channel. Tonight we will explore the pyramids, monuments so precisely built that their stones fit together with gaps smaller than a fingernail, aligned to the stars with an accuracy that still puzzles modern engineers. But these were not built by mysterious forces or lost civilizations. They were built by ordinary human beings who ate bread, drank beer, and painted jokes on the walls in the dark. Therefore, what they left behind is something that feels almost impossible, a monument that exceeds the tools that built it, the kind of thing that makes the mind grow quiet just by standing near it. But you do not need to stand near it tonight. You only need to rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and still, and let the warm desert settle around you. Therefore, everything else can wait. If this helps you sleep, consider liking and subscribing, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin with the pyramids.
Most people picture the pyramids as rough, sandy, and golden brown, worn down by thousands of years of desert wind blowing across the open desert. But that is not how they looked when they were first built thousands of years ago. The ancient Egyptians covered every single surface with a layer of smooth, brilliant white limestone, polished so carefully and so finely that it reflected sunlight across the desert like a giant mirror standing at the very edge of the world. Therefore, from miles and miles away, across the Nile River, across the open sand, across the wide and endless blue sky, the pyramids blazed with light, visible to anyone who turned their eyes toward the horizon on a clear and sunny day. Travelers approaching from distant lands would have seen them glowing long before they could see anything else on the landscape. But here is what makes this even harder to believe. That entire white shell is almost completely gone today, stripped away over the centuries by human hands. Over hundreds of years, people removed those beautiful casing stones one by one, block by block, to build mosques, palaces, and city walls in what would become the city of Cairo. Therefore, what we see standing in the desert right now is only the rough inner skeleton of something far more dazzling and breathtaking than we can easily imagine from looking at old photographs. The pyramids we know today are, in a quiet way, unfinished pictures of something greater, echoes of a brilliance that once made the whole horizon shine like the surface of a calm and sunlit sea. But even as skeletons, even stripped of their white armor, they still stand enormous and still, holding their shape against the sky with the same patience they have always had. Therefore, when you look at the pyramids today, you are not seeing them as they were meant to be seen. You are seeing what 4,000 years of time has left behind, and somehow that makes them even more beautiful. When most people think of pyramids, Egypt is the first and only place that comes to mind, as if the story of pyramids begins and ends along the Nile. But if you were to carefully count every pyramid still standing in the world today, you would find more of them in Sudan than in Egypt, which surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Sudan, the large country located just south of Egypt, has over 200 ancient pyramids scattered quietly across its desert landscape, built by a remarkable civilization known as the Nubians over many centuries. Therefore, Sudan holds the largest collection of pyramids on Earth, and yet almost no one outside of archaeology circles ever talks about it, or includes it in the story of the ancient world. But the Nubian pyramids look quite different from the Egyptian ones most people recognize. They are taller, more narrow, and sharply pointed, almost like needles or thin fingers reaching up toward the sky, rather than the wide and broad mountains of stone we see at Giza. Therefore, each Nubian pyramid has its own quiet character and personality, and they stand in small clusters across the open sand, often with no tourists nearby, no crowds of visitors, no noise of any kind, just the dry wind, the golden desert, and the ancient stone holding its silence. But even more surprising and a little heartbreaking is the fact that many of these pyramids were badly damaged in the 1800s by a European treasure hunter who actually blew off their tops with explosives while searching for gold and valuables buried inside. Therefore, they stand today with broken and jagged crowns, missing their pointed tips, and yet still somehow dignified and graceful, still watching the sky as they have for thousands of years, patient and unbothered as the desert itself tends to be. But their broken state also tells a story about how the world treated ancient things before it understood their value, and about how much can be lost when curiosity turns careless. Therefore, standing among the Nubian pyramids today feels like standing in a place the rest of the world forgot to visit, which makes the silence around them feel even deeper and more meaningful than words can easily carry. It is genuinely difficult for the human mind to wrap itself around how truly large the Great Pyramid of Giza really is, because numbers alone rarely do the job of making us feel the scale. But one simple comparison has a way of making the size suddenly very real and very physical in the imagination. The Great Pyramid contains enough stone to build a wall 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide that would stretch all the way around the entire country of France without running out of material. Therefore, we are not simply talking about a large building or an impressive monument. We are talking about a structure so overwhelmingly massive that its stone could circle an entire nation and still have blocks left over to spare. But what makes this even more astonishing, even more difficult to hold in the mind, is that every single one of those millions of blocks was cut by human hands, moved by human hands, and placed by human hands, without engines, without electricity, without cranes, and without any of the steel machines we would consider absolutely necessary for a project like this today. Therefore, every number you hear about the pyramid, 2.3 million blocks, 20 years of construction, tens of thousands of workers moving through the heat, stops being just a number and starts feeling like something that sits just outside the edge of what seems possible. But it happened, and the proof is right there in the desert, solid and unmoving, exactly where those ancient hands left it. Therefore, every time you try to explain the Great Pyramid using simple and comfortable logic, you find yourself slowly running out of satisfying answers, left standing quietly in front of something the human mind created but can barely hold in its imagination all at once. Deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, something quietly remarkable happens every single day, through every season, through every year that passes over the desert outside. The temperature inside the pyramid stays almost perfectly constant at around 20 degrees Celsius, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, steady and unchanged no matter what the outside world is doing. But outside those thick stone walls, the Egyptian desert can reach temperatures of over 40 degrees during the burning summer days, and then drop sharply and suddenly when the sun goes down at night. Therefore, while the world outside moves through its daily cycle of heat and cold, light and darkness, the interior of the pyramid remains perfectly still, balanced, and cool, as if the stone itself has somehow learned to breathe slowly and regulate itself like a living thing. But no engineer or scientist has been able to fully and satisfyingly explain why this happens with such remarkable consistency across thousands of years of changing climate. Therefore, the pyramid sits in the middle of one of the hottest and most extreme environments on Earth and maintains, without any technology or effort, a temperature that feels almost designed for human comfort and stillness. But what is even more interesting is that this constant temperature was almost certainly noticed by the ancient Egyptians themselves, who may have understood something about the stone, and the shape, and the thickness of the walls, that modern science is still working carefully to explain. Therefore, when you imagine lying down inside the Great Pyramid on a burning summer afternoon, the air around you cool and steady and quiet, the stone walls thick and ancient on every side, it becomes a little easier to understand why those who built it believed it was connected to something larger than ordinary human life, something eternal, something that did not change with the seasons or the years. The story most people carry in their heads about the pyramid builders is one of suffering. Thousands of slaves driven by cruelty across the desert sand under the burning Egyptian sun. But that story, as dramatic and familiar as it is, turns out to be wrong in almost every important detail. The people who built the pyramids were not slaves at all. They were skilled and organized workers who received wages for their labor, were fed generous daily meals, and had access to doctors and medical care when they were injured or fell ill on the construction site. Therefore, the pyramids were not built on suffering alone, but on something closer to a massive, organized, and surprisingly well-managed public works project, one of the largest the ancient world had ever attempted or imagined. But the evidence for this is not just a theory or a guess. Archaeologists have found the actual villages where the workers lived, complete with bakeries that produced thousands of loaves of bread every day, breweries making beer, and graveyards where workers were buried with care and respect when they died. Therefore, the bones found in those graves show signs of injuries that had been treated and healed, which means these people received medical attention that actually worked, which was remarkably advanced for a civilization 4,500 years old. But perhaps the most human and surprising detail of all is that the workers signed their teams with playful and affectionate names. Names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, written in paint on the stones they placed inside the pyramid. Therefore, inside the very walls of the Great Pyramid, hidden in the dark where no one was supposed to see them, ancient human beings left behind their humor, their pride, and their personalities, reminding us across thousands of years that the people who built one of the greatest structures in history were, in the most important ways, very much like us. Lining up 2.5 million stone blocks into a nearly perfect square sounds like the kind of task that would challenge even the most advanced construction teams working with modern equipment and laser-guided tools. But the ancient Egyptians managed it with wooden sticks, copper tools, and a deep understanding of the stars, the sun, and the movements of shadows across the ground. They used a simple instrument called a merket, which worked a little like a modern compass or a surveyor's tool, allowing them to read the position of stars in the night sky and use that information to draw straight and precise lines across the desert floor. Therefore, the four sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned with the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy so close to perfect that modern GPS measurements find an error of less than 1/10 of a single degree, which is almost nothing across a base that stretches 230 meters on every side. But the alignment is only half of the story, because the base of the pyramid is also almost perfectly flat. No corner sits more than 2 centimeters higher than any other corner across that entire enormous surface of stone. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians achieved a level of precision that many modern engineers openly describe as extraordinary, not because it was done at all, but because it was done at that scale, with those tools, in that time. But what is truly difficult to explain is how they transferred that precision upward, block by block, course by course, maintaining their alignments as the pyramid grew taller and the ground became harder and harder to reference directly. Therefore, every time a researcher measures the Great Pyramid and finds it still holding its geometry after 4,500 years of earthquakes, floods, and the slow, grinding pressure of time, it feels less like a coincidence and more like a quiet message left behind by people who understood something about permanence that the rest of the world was still learning. The pyramids of Giza and the belt of the constellation Orion share a relationship that has fascinated astronomers, archaeologists, and curious people for decades, ever since researchers first noticed how strikingly the layout matched the pattern of 3 stars. The 3 pyramids at Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafra, and the smaller Pyramid of Menkaure, are not arranged in a perfectly straight line, and that slight offset turns out to mirror almost exactly the slight offset of the 3 stars in Orion's belt as they appear in the night sky above Egypt. But whether this alignment was intentional or a remarkable coincidence is a question that researchers still debate with genuine passion and disagreement, because the evidence points in both directions without fully settling in either. Therefore, the mystery stays open, which in its own way makes the pyramids feel even more alive, not as solved monuments, but as questions still standing in the desert, still waiting for an answer. But what is not debated is that the ancient Egyptians watched the stars with extraordinary care and devotion, charting their movements across the sky with the same patience and precision they applied to cutting stone, and that Orion held a very special and sacred place in their understanding of the universe and the afterlife. Therefore, when the ventilation shafts inside the Great Pyramid are measured and projected outward into the night sky, they point directly at specific stars, including Orion and Thuban, which was the North Star in ancient Egyptian times, suggesting that the pyramid was not just a tomb, but a kind of permanent stone telescope aimed at the heavens. But even setting aside the debate about intention and design, There is something quietly moving about standing under the night sky near Giza, looking up at Orion's belt and then looking down at the three pyramids on the horizon, and feeling the two images settle gently into each other like two halves of the same thought. Therefore, whatever the ancient Egyptians meant when they built those pyramids under those stars, they built something that still makes people stop and look up, still connects the ground beneath our feet to the sky above our heads, and still refuses to let the conversation end. Inside the Great Pyramid, hidden in the darkness of corridors that have been sealed for thousands of years, ancient Egyptian workers left something behind that no one expected to find: graffiti. Not the careful and formal hieroglyphs carved into temple walls for gods and kings, but quick, informal, human marks painted in red pigment by the hands of ordinary workers who never imagined anyone would read them. But these marks are not random scratches. They are the names of the work gangs, the teams of men who cut and carried and placed the stones, written with a kind of pride and humor that reaches across 4,500 years with surprising warmth. Therefore, inside the very core of one of the most mysterious and awe-inspiring structures ever built, we find something deeply familiar. People writing their names on things, claiming their work, leaving a trace of themselves for anyone who might one day look. But some of the names are genuinely funny in a way that makes the ancient world feel suddenly close and human. One team called themselves Friends of Khufu, while another proudly went by Drunkards of Menkaure, which suggests that the workers had a sense of humor about their king and about themselves that no official record would ever have preserved. Therefore, the pyramids are not just monuments to power and religion. They are also, hidden in their deepest and darkest chambers, monuments to ordinary human beings doing hard work and finding small ways to make each other laugh while they did it. But what makes these marks even more remarkable is where they were found: in chambers that were sealed immediately after construction, rooms that were never meant to be opened again, which means the workers wrote those names knowing full well that no one would read them for a very long time, if ever. Therefore, they were not writing for an audience. They were writing for themselves, which is perhaps the most honest and touching kind of writing there is. And the fact that we can still read their words today feels like a small and quiet miracle of stone and time. Standing inside the Great Pyramid, in the darkness of the king's chamber with its massive granite walls pressing close on every side, researchers and visitors have noticed something that cannot be easily explained away. The room produces a deep, resonant hum, a low vibration that seems to rise from the stone itself and settle into the body of anyone standing still enough to feel it, creating a sensation that many people describe as calm, heavy, and unusually peaceful. But this is not just a subjective impression reported by spiritual seekers or imaginative tourists. Acoustic researchers have measured the frequency of this sound and found that it sits in a range that is known to affect human brainwaves, slowing them down toward the same patterns that appear during deep meditation or the early stages of sleep. Therefore, it is possible, not proven, but genuinely possible, that the ancient Egyptians designed the internal chambers of the pyramid with an awareness of how sound and stone and the human body interact with each other in ways that we are only beginning to study scientifically. But the mystery goes further than one room, because multiple chambers and corridors inside the pyramid produce different acoustic effects, as if the entire structure was tuned like an instrument, with each space playing a different role in the overall experience of moving through it. Therefore, the Great Pyramid may be not only an architectural achievement and a tomb and a star map, but also a kind of carefully designed environment for altering the state of human consciousness. A stone machine, built not just to house a body, but to change the minds of those who entered it. But we cannot know for certain what the ancient Egyptians intended, because they left no simple manual, no straightforward explanation, only the stone and the sound and the silence. Therefore, every time someone stands inside that chamber and feels the hum move through them, they are participating in an experience that may be 4,500 years old, older than most languages, older than most cities, older than almost everything except the slow and patient turning of the earth itself. The word pyramid sounds ancient and foreign, but the ancient Egyptians had their own name for these structures, and that name carries a meaning that changes the way the whole thing feels. They called it myrrh, a word whose exact meaning is still debated by linguists and historians, but which many researchers believe may mean place of ascension, a doorway, in other words, not a tomb. But the shape itself was never accidental or merely practical. The triangular form rising from a wide base to a single sharp point was a deliberate and deeply meaningful choice that connected the structure to the most powerful force in Egyptian life, which was the sun. Therefore, when you look at a pyramid from a distance on a clear and sunny day, you can see what the Egyptians saw: the shape of sunlight itself, the way rays spread downward from a point in the sky and fan out across the earth, exactly the form that a pyramid traces from its peak down to its four wide corners. But the ancient Egyptians took this connection further still, believing that the pyramid's shape literally gathered and focused the energy of the sun and channeled it upward through the point at the top, carrying the soul of the pharaoh from the physical world into the realm of the gods. Therefore, the pyramid was not designed to keep something inside. It was designed to send something upward, to act as a permanent and indestructible launching point between the world of the living and whatever the Egyptians believed waited beyond it. But modern researchers studying the electromagnetic properties of pyramid shapes have found something genuinely interesting. Certain pyramid proportions do appear to concentrate and focus certain types of energy in measurable ways, though the science is still young and the conclusions are still cautious. Therefore, what began as a spiritual and poetic idea, a shape that carries things upward, turns out to have a physical dimension that the ancient Egyptians may have understood intuitively, thousands of years before the instruments existed to measure it, which is the kind of discovery that makes the silence around the pyramids feel a little less empty and a little more like a conversation still waiting to continue. The pyramids of Giza are famous across the entire world, recognized instantly by billions of people who have never set foot in Egypt and never will. But almost no one who can picture those three famous triangles against the desert sky knows that Egypt has more than 130 pyramids in total, spread across the desert in clusters and groups that most tourists never visit, and most textbooks never mention. The three pyramids at Giza are, in the full picture, a small and famous corner of a much larger and quieter story, one that stretches for hundreds of kilometers along the Nile and spans thousands of years of building, experimenting, failing, and trying again. Therefore, the history of Egyptian pyramids is not a single story with 3 chapters, but a long and winding conversation between a civilization and the sky, carried on across centuries by kings and architects and workers who each added their own voice to the structure of the landscape. But many of these lesser-known pyramids are in poor condition today, worn down by wind and sand and centuries of stone removal, and some are so eroded that they look more like natural hills than man-made monuments, easily missed by anyone who does not already know to look for them. Therefore, driving through the Egyptian desert away from the tourist routes means passing through a landscape that is, in a quiet and unremarked way, one of the most densely monument-filled places on Earth, full of structures that once held kings and gods in the hopes of an entire civilization for the afterlife. But the fact that most of these pyramids are unknown and unvisited gives them a different kind of presence than the famous ones. They stand in the open desert without crowds or cameras, without souvenir stands or guided tours, holding their silence in a way that the pyramids at Giza, for all their magnificence, can no longer quite manage. Therefore, the full story of Egyptian pyramids is not the story of 3 famous shapes on a famous horizon. It is the story of a civilization that spent thousands of years reaching upward, over and over again, in stone, in sand, in silence, building toward something it never stopped believing in. Pyramid workers were not nameless or faceless. They were organized, they were proud, and they left behind records of their daily lives that archaeologists are still carefully reading today. But perhaps the most surprising thing those records reveal is not how hard the work was, which was very hard indeed, but how well the workers were treated compared to almost any other labor force in the ancient world at that time. The workers who built the Great Pyramid ate a daily diet that included bread, fish, meat, onions, and garlic, a varied and nutritious diet by ancient standards, and they received regular supplies of beer, which was not a luxury in ancient Egypt, but a basic and important source of calories and nutrition. Therefore, the pyramid builders were not starving laborers, driven by fear, but fed and maintained workers whose physical condition was important enough to their employers that actual resources were spent keeping them healthy and capable of hard daily work. But the records go even further because the workers also had time off. They took breaks for religious holidays. They had sick days. And the records show instances of workers going on strike when their rations were delayed, which means they understood their own rights well enough to demand them openly. Therefore, the pyramid builders were not passive sufferers, but active participants in a working relationship, one complicated and imperfect by modern standards, but far more human and organized than the slavery narrative most people have inherited from old Hollywood films and popular imagination. But the most intimate records come from the graffiti and the team names painted inside the pyramid itself. Friends of Khufu, drunkards of Menkaure. Names that carry humor and camaraderie across 4,000 years, as easily as a text message carries a joke across a room today. Therefore, when you look at the Great Pyramid and try to feel the weight of the human effort inside it, the truest picture is not one of suffering and chains, but of thousands of people working together, complaining together, eating together, and finding small reasons to laugh in the middle of one of the largest construction projects the ancient world had ever attempted. High on the very top of each completed Egyptian pyramid, placed like a crown at the exact point where stone met sky, sat a special capstone called a pyramidion. And this capstone was not plain or simple or hidden away from sight, but it was in many cases covered in polished gold or electrum, which is a natural alloy of gold and silver, hammered smooth and reflective so that it would catch the very first rays of sunlight each morning before any other surface in the landscape was touched by the dawn. Therefore, when the sun rose over the Egyptian desert, the first thing it illuminated was not the ground or the river or the city, but the golden tip of the pyramid, blazing above everything else like a second sun balanced at the top of a mountain of white stone. But this was not simply decorative. It was deeply theological, because the ancient Egyptians believed that the sun god Ra touched the pyramidion first each morning, and that this contact between divine light and sacred stone was the moment when the energy of the gods entered the physical world and the day truly began. Therefore, the pyramid was designed to participate in the sunrise, to be part of the daily ritual of light returning to the world. And the golden capstone was the point of contact between the human construction below and the divine movement above. But almost none of the original pyramidions survive today. They were removed, melted down, or lost over thousands of years of history, leaving the pyramids with flat or broken tops where their crowns once caught the light. Therefore, when you see a photograph of the pyramids today and notice that their tops look bare and unfinished, you are seeing something incomplete. The pyramids as they stand now are like statues missing their heads, magnificent and powerful still, but missing the one piece that connected them most directly to the sky they were always reaching toward. Scientists who study the hidden interiors of ancient monuments face a very particular and frustrating problem. The thing they most want to examine is sealed behind walls of stone several meters thick, and opening those walls would destroy the very thing they are trying to understand. But in recent years, a remarkable technology has given researchers a new way to see inside the pyramids without touching them at all, using something called muon tomography, a method that uses tiny particles from outer space to take pictures of what is hidden inside solid rock. Muons are particles produced constantly by cosmic rays hitting the upper atmosphere, and they rain down on the Earth's surface in enormous numbers every second of every day, passing through solid matter the way X-rays pass through soft tissue, but with far greater penetrating power. Therefore, by placing detectors inside and around the pyramids and measuring how moons move through the stone, researchers can build three-dimensional maps of the pyramid's interior and identify empty spaces, chambers, corridors, voids, that no human eye has seen since the pyramid was sealed thousands of years ago. But in 2017, a team of international researchers, using exactly this method, announced the discovery of a large void inside the Great Pyramid, located above the Grand Gallery, a space at least 30 meters long that does not correspond to any known chamber or passage in the pyramid's interior. Therefore, inside the most studied and examined monument in human history, there is a room, or something like a room, that no modern human has entered, that no archaeologist has mapped, that no camera has photographed, sitting quietly in the dark above one of the most visited tourist sites on Earth. But what is inside that void? Why it was built? And what the ancient Egyptians placed there? Or did their remains completely unknown? Because the technology that found it cannot yet tell us what it contains, only that it exists and that it is empty of stone. Therefore, the Great Pyramid, after all these centuries of study and measurement and exploration, still holds a secret in its heart, still keeps something back, still reminds every researcher who comes close enough to listen that the conversation between modern science and ancient Egypt is nowhere near finished. The sealed chambers deep inside the Great Pyramid have been closed to the outside world for thousands of years, and in that long darkness, something interesting has happened to the air. But when researchers and explorers have entered previously sealed sections of the pyramid, they have sometimes reported an unusual and unexpected experience. Not just the staleness of ancient air, which one might expect, but a strange stillness. A quality of quiet that feels different from ordinary silence, as if the space itself has been holding its breath for a very long time. The King's Chamber, built from enormous blocks of red Aswan granite and sealed within the heart of the pyramid, is the room where this experience is most commonly reported and most carefully studied by the researchers who take it seriously. Therefore, the room has become a subject of genuine scientific interest, not just for its architecture and its history, but for its acoustic and atmospheric properties, which appear to do measurable things to the physical and mental state of people who spend time inside it. But the granite walls of the King's Chamber produce a resonance, a low, steady hum, when struck or when sound is introduced into the space, and the frequency of that resonance sits in a range that researchers associate with altered states of consciousness, deep relaxation, and the borderline between wakefulness and sleep. Therefore, it is genuinely possible that the ancient Egyptians understood something about the relationship between stone, sound, and the human nervous system that modern neuroscience is only beginning to approach from a different direction, using different instruments but arriving at some of the same places. But no written record from ancient Egypt explains this directly. There is no instruction manual for the acoustic design of the King's Chamber, no text that says, "We built this room to make the mind grow quiet." Therefore, the intention behind it, if there was an intention, lives only in the stone itself, in the frequency it produces, and in the experience of every person who has stood inside it in the dark and felt, without quite being able to explain why, that something in the room was humming back. The stones that form the outer casing of the Great Pyramid, the smooth white limestone that once made it shine like a mirror, came from quarries located just across the Nile River, close enough that the transport was manageable, but still an enormous logistical challenge given the weight and number of blocks required. But the stones used for the interior chambers, particularly the granite blocks of the King's Chamber, came from a place called Aswan, which is located over 800 kilometers to the south along the Nile, a distance that raises an immediate and obvious question. How do you move blocks of granite weighing up to 80 tons across 800 kilometers without motorized transport of any kind? Therefore, the answer involves the Nile River itself, which the ancient Egyptians used as their highway, floating the massive granite blocks on wooden boats or rafts during the annual flood season when the water was high enough to carry enormous weights without grounding. But the logistics of this operation, cutting the blocks from the quarry face, lowering them to the riverbank, loading them onto boats without cranes, sailing them north for weeks, unloading them, and then moving them across the desert to the construction site, represent a level of organized planning and engineering that staggers the imagination, even when you understand each individual step. Therefore, the Great Pyramid is not just an achievement of construction, but an achievement of supply chain management on a scale that few modern organizations would attempt with the tools available today, let alone with wood, rope, copper, and human muscle. But what makes the Aswan granite even more remarkable is its quality. The blocks are cut with a precision that suggests the ancient Egyptians had techniques for working hard stone that we have not fully reconstructed, because modern attempts to replicate their results using period-accurate tools have consistently fallen short of the smoothness and accuracy the originals display. Therefore, somewhere between Aswan and Giza, somewhere between the quarry and the finished chamber, the ancient Egyptians were doing something with stone that we can admire and measure and photograph but cannot yet fully explain or reproduce, which is a quiet and persistent reminder that the distance between ancient and primitive is not as short as it sometimes feels. Egypt is famous for its pyramids, but the pyramid shape was not a uniquely Egyptian idea. It arose independently in cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, which is one of the most quietly mysterious patterns in the entire history of human civilization. But the most striking parallel is the one between Egypt and Mexico, because the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, built by a civilization that had no contact whatsoever with ancient Egypt, has a base measurement that is almost exactly equal to the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, both approximately 230 meters on each side, a coincidence so precise that it has occupied researchers for decades. Therefore, two civilizations on opposite sides of the world, separated by an ocean and by thousands of years of independent development, arrived at almost exactly the same base dimensions for their greatest pyramid structures, using the same general shape, the same orientation toward the cardinal directions, and the same purpose of connecting the earthly with the divine. But pyramid shapes also appear in Cambodia at Angkor Wat, in China, where enormous earthen pyramids cover the tombs of ancient emperors, in Sudan with its narrow Nubian spires, and even in parts of Europe where ancient stepped structures suggest the same basic impulse to build something triangular and pointed toward the sky. Therefore, the pyramid may be less a specifically Egyptian invention and more a universal human response to a universal human feeling. The feeling of wanting to build something that reaches upward, something that points from the ground toward whatever we believe exists above it. But the fact that so many cultures arrived at this same shape independently, without communicating with each other, suggests that there may be something about the pyramid form itself, its stability, its visual power, its directional clarity, that speaks to something deep and shared in human psychology. Therefore, when you look at a pyramid, you may be seeing not just the achievement of one ancient culture, but the expression of something older and wider than any single civilization. A shape that human beings keep returning to across every ocean and every century, as if the form itself contains an answer to a question we have never quite stopped asking. The ancient Egyptians understood the sky with an intimacy and precision that modern city dwellers, surrounded by electric light and glass and concrete, find almost impossible to fully imagine. But their relationship with the stars was not merely observational or scientific. It was personal and theological, woven into every aspect of their daily life, their calendar, their religion, and their architecture in ways that made the night sky feel like a living ceiling they shared with their gods. The constellation Orion held a particularly sacred place in Egyptian cosmology, associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection, whose story of death and return mapped perfectly onto the way Orion disappears below the horizon for a period each year, and then rises again. Therefore, when the Egyptians designed the ventilation shafts of the Great Pyramid, two narrow passages rising at precise angles from the king's chamber upward through the body of the pyramid, they aimed them not randomly but deliberately, with one shaft pointing toward Orion's belt and another toward Thuban, the star that occupied the position of the North Pole star at the time the pyramid was built. But the word ventilation may actually be a misnomer, because these shafts are too narrow to move significant amounts of air, and they do not connect directly to the outside in a way that would make them practical for ventilation. Their true purpose was almost certainly spiritual, designed to give the pharaoh's soul a direct and permanent pathway from the burial chamber upward to the stars it was meant to join. Therefore, the Great Pyramid is, among all its other identities, a permanently aimed instrument, a stone telescope pointed at specific locations in the sky, built to last not for years or decades, but for eternity, because the Egyptians believed that eternity was exactly how long the soul would need the pathway to remain open. But the stars move over thousands of years due to a slow wobble in the Earth's axis called precession, which means the shafts no longer point exactly where they once pointed, and the stars they were aimed at have drifted slightly from their ancient positions. Therefore, the Great Pyramid carries inside it a kind of timestamp, a record written not in words but in angles, telling anyone who understands the mathematics exactly when it was built, because the geometry of the shafts only aligns perfectly with the sky as it appeared over Egypt roughly 4,500 years ago. The Great Pyramid once had an entrance door so extraordinary that travelers and explorers who discovered it described the experience as almost magical. Not a fixed opening cut into the stone, but a pivoting door, a massive block of limestone, so precisely balanced on a hidden pivot point that a single person could push it open from the inside with one hand, despite the fact that it weighed several tons. But from the outside, this door was essentially invisible. When closed, it fit so perfectly into the surrounding stonework that its edges were nearly impossible to detect, blending seamlessly into the flat white casing stones that covered the pyramid's face. Therefore, the entrance to the Great Pyramid was, by design, a secret, not hidden in the way a locked box is hidden, with an obvious mechanism that signals something is being concealed, but hidden in the way a held breath is hidden, present and invisible at the same time, detectable only to those who already knew exactly where to press. But this level of engineering precision, a multi-ton door balanced well enough to swing open with minimal force, fitted well enough to disappear into a flat wall, represents a mastery of mechanics that required not just skill, but a deep understanding of weight distribution, pivot geometry, and stone cutting that modern engineers openly admire. Therefore, the pyramid builders were not simply moving and stacking large rocks. They were working with stone the way a watchmaker works with metal, fitting pieces together with a precision measured in fractions of a millimeter across surfaces that weighed thousands of kilograms. But the original swinging door no longer exists in its functional form. It was damaged during early explorations of the pyramid, and what remains today is a fixed and obvious opening that gives no sense of the elegant concealment the original design achieved. Therefore, every photograph of the Great Pyramid's entrance that you have ever seen shows you a wound rather than a door, a place where something precise and beautiful was broken open by people who did not yet understand what they were breaking, which is a small and quiet loss inside a monument that has survived almost everything else the world has thrown at it. The mortar used to bind the stones of the Great Pyramid together is one of the most quietly astonishing materials in the entire history of construction, not because it is exotic or rare, but because it is, after 4,500 years of desert heat, earthquake vibrations, and the slow, grinding pressure of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above, still stronger than the stones it was meant to hold together. But this means that if you tried to separate two pyramid stones that are bonded with the original ancient mortar, the stone itself would crack before the mortar gave way. The binding is more durable than the material it binds, which is an outcome that modern material scientists find genuinely remarkable and not entirely explainable. Researchers have analyzed the mortar extensively, identifying its basic components, a mixture of gypsum, sand, and water, with traces of other materials. But when they attempt to recreate it using the same ingredients and the same ratios, the result does not match the original's performance, suggesting that either the process of mixing and applying it involved steps or conditions that have not been identified, or that 4,000 years of slow chemical change under pressure has transformed the material into something that no fresh mixture can replicate. Therefore, the recipe for pyramid mortar is, in a very real sense, lost. Not because it was hidden or destroyed, but because the thing that makes it extraordinary may be time itself, the slow and patient chemistry of centuries, doing something to the mixture that no laboratory can accelerate or reproduce in the short span of a human research project. But this raises a subtle and interesting question about ancient knowledge, whether the Egyptians knew their mortar would improve with age, whether they built their timing into the material the way a winemaker builds aging into a vintage, designing something that would become more itself over centuries rather than less. Therefore, the mortar in the Great Pyramid is not just a building material but a kind of slow and silent argument, a substance that has been making its case for 4,500 years, growing stronger with every century that passes, quietly outlasting every attempt to understand it fully, and still holding together the stones of a structure that the rest of the world has spent millennia trying to explain. The pyramid builders of ancient Egypt did not simply drag stones across dry desert sand and hope for the best. They understood physics well enough to solve one of the most fundamental problems in moving enormous weight across a flat surface, and they solved it with something as simple and available as water. But the desert sand that surrounded the construction site was not just an inconvenience. It was an active obstacle because dry sand compresses and shifts under heavy loads, creating enormous friction that would have made dragging a multi-ton stone block almost impossibly difficult, even with hundreds of workers pulling on ropes. When researchers examined a painted scene on the wall of an ancient Egyptian tomb, they noticed something that had been overlooked for years. A figure walking in front of a sledge carrying a massive stone statue, pouring liquid from a jar directly onto the sand just ahead of the runners. Therefore, that small painted figure was not performing a ritual or making an offering. He was doing something practical and effective, wetting the sand just enough to change its physical properties from loose and resistant to firm and slippery, reducing the friction under the sledge by as much as 50% according to modern physics calculations. But this discovery, made by a team of Dutch physicists who tested the principle in a laboratory using actual sand and actual sledge runners, confirmed that the ancient Egyptians had an intuitive and working understanding of a principle that modern engineers call tribology, the science of friction, lubrication, and the interaction between surfaces in motion. Therefore, the pyramids were built not just with muscle and organization, but with applied physics, with a practical knowledge of how materials behave under pressure that was sophisticated enough to solve engineering problems that would challenge a modern construction team working without powered equipment. But the elegance of the solution is what lingers. Not a complicated machine, not a lost technology requiring special materials, just water and sand and the careful observation of someone who noticed that wet ground moves differently than dry ground and decided to use that difference. Therefore, somewhere in the long chain of decisions and discoveries that resulted in the Great Pyramid standing exactly where it stands today, there was a moment when someone poured water on sand, watched a heavy thing move more easily, and understood that they had found something worth remembering. A small discovery that helped build one of the largest structures in human history. When archaeologists first began seriously excavating the areas around the pyramids of Giza in the 20th century, they expected to find temples, causeways, and storage areas. But what they found instead, buried under centuries of sand and time, was something far more intimate and far more revealing. An entire town, a complete and organized settlement where the pyramid builders lived, worked, ate, slept, raised families, got sick, recovered, and eventually died, often within sight of the monuments they were spending their lives constructing. The workers' village at Giza contained bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread every single day, breweries making large quantities of beer, fish processing areas where the daily protein ration was prepared, and administrative buildings where the logistics of feeding and managing tens of thousands of workers were organized with a bureaucratic precision that left written records on pottery fragments and papyrus. Therefore, the pyramid was not built by a faceless mass of suffering humanity, but by a community, a temporary city that grew up in the shadow of the construction site and developed its own rhythms, its own social structures, its own culture of work and rest and human connection. But the most moving part of this discovery was not the food or the administration, but the cemetery, a graveyard where workers who died during construction were buried with genuine care, their bodies wrapped and placed in proper tombs, their graves sometimes marked with small offerings that suggest their families mourned them and believed they deserved a dignified passage into the afterlife, just as much as the pharaoh they were building the pyramid for. Therefore, the pyramid builders were not expendable. They were people whose deaths were acknowledged, whose lives were valued enough to record, and whose physical remains have now told us, through the careful analysis of their bones, that they suffered injuries consistent with heavy physical labor, that some of those injuries were treated successfully by doctors, and that they lived and died as workers who were, within the limits of their time and world, genuinely cared for. But standing in that cemetery today, looking at the small and simple graves arranged in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, it is impossible not to feel the weight of the connection. The workers who built the most famous monument in the world lying in the ground just beside it, still there, still close, as if even in death they could not quite bring themselves to leave the thing they had spent their lives making. High above the desert floor, at the very peak of each completed pyramid, the ancient Egyptians placed a special stone that served as the crown of the entire structure. A pyramidion, a small pyramid-shaped capstone that compressed the entire geometry of the monument into a single final point where stone met sky. But these capstones were not left plain. The most important ones were covered in polished gold or electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that the Egyptians prized for its ability to catch and hold light. And they were positioned so that the very first ray of sunlight each morning would strike the golden tip before touching anything else in the landscape. Therefore, each day began, from the perspective of anyone watching from the Nile Valley or the surrounding desert, with a single point of gold fire igniting at the top of the pyramid in the pre-dawn darkness, the sun touching the sacred structure before it touched the ground, before it touched the river, before it touched the faces of the people watching from below. But this was not merely beautiful, it was theological, because the ancient Egyptians believed that this daily contact between sunlight and pyramidion was the moment when divine energy entered the physical world, when the boundary between the realm of the gods and the realm of the living was briefly and brilliantly dissolved by light. Therefore, the pyramid was designed to participate in the cosmology of the universe, not just to sit in it. It was a structure that played an active role in the daily drama of existence, a permanent stone actor in the performance of the sunrise that the Egyptians believed kept the world alive and ordered. But almost none of the original pyramidions survive. They were removed over centuries, melted for their gold, lost to the confusion of history, leaving the pyramids standing today with bare and broken tops that give no hint of the golden crowns they once wore. Therefore, every sunrise over Giza today is a quieter and dimmer version of what it once was. The sun still rises, the light still spreads across the desert, but the point of gold that once caught the first ray and sent it blazing across the valley is gone, and the pyramids receive the morning light now in silence, their crowns missing, their greeting to the sun no longer answered. For most of recorded history, the story that circulated most widely about the pyramid builders was one of slavery and suffering. Thousands of people driven by force across the desert, working under the threat of punishment, their labor extracted rather than given. But this story, compelling and dramatic as it is, rests almost entirely on a single ancient source, a description written by the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built and recorded what local guides told him, which was already ancient tradition by then rather than living memory. Therefore, everything Herodotus wrote about the pyramid builders was filtered through 2,000 years of oral tradition, translation, cultural interpretation, and the natural human tendency to dramatize and simplify complex historical realities into stories that are easier to tell and easier to remember. But the actual physical evidence, the workers' village, the medical records in the bones, the food remains, the administrative papyri, the graffiti, the team names, tells a story that is more complicated and in many ways more interesting than slavery, because it describes something that has no simple modern equivalent, a system of large-scale obligatory labor that was also, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely organized and genuinely maintained. Therefore, the pyramid builders occupied a category that our modern vocabulary struggles to name accurately. Not free in the way we use that word today, not enslaved in the way that word carries its full weight today, but something in between that belonged specifically to ancient Egypt and to the particular relationship between Pharaoh and people that defined Egyptian society for 3,000 years. But what the evidence does make clear, without ambiguity, is that the people who built the pyramids ate well enough to do heavy work, lived in organized communities, received medical treatment when injured, were buried with respect when they died, and felt enough ownership over their labor to give their work gangs funny names and paint them on the stones. Therefore, the pyramid builders were human beings in the fullest sense, complex, organized, capable of humor and pride and community. And the monuments they left behind are not just achievements of engineering, but achievements of humanity, built not only with stone and mortar, but with the daily effort of thousands of ordinary lives that history almost forgot to notice. The ancient Egyptians were not the first people to build a pyramid. The first attempt was made by a pharaoh named Djoser, whose architect Imhotep began with a plan for a simple flat-topped tomb called a mastaba. And then, in a series of decisions that changed the history of architecture forever, kept adding to it until it had grown into something the world had never seen before. But the Step Pyramid of Djoser, built around 2650 BCE at a site called Saqqara, does not look like the smooth-sided pyramids most people picture. It rises in 6 distinct stepped levels, each one smaller than the one below, like a giant staircase climbing toward the sky, which is exactly what the ancient Egyptians believed it was. Therefore, the Step Pyramid was a literal staircase to heaven, a physical structure designed to give the pharaoh's soul a series of platforms to climb on its journey from the earth to the realm of the gods, and the shape made visual and architectural sense within a theology that imagined the afterlife as an upward journey rather than a downward one. But what makes the Step Pyramid remarkable beyond its age and its theological meaning is the sheer ambition of what Imhotep attempted. Before this structure, Egyptians built in mud brick and wood, materials that decay and disappear. But Imhotep chose stone, large blocks of it, cut and stacked in a way that had never been done before on this scale, essentially inventing monumental stone architecture in a single project. Therefore, Imhotep was not just an architect, but a pioneer, a person who looked at the building materials and methods available to him and decided to do something entirely new with them, something so new that it had no precedent and no guarantee of success, only the ambition of a pharaoh and the vision of one remarkably gifted mind. But Imhotep was also, unusually for an ancient craftsman, remembered by name. He was deified after his death, worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine for centuries after his pyramid was built, which is an extraordinary fate for someone whose original job was to design a tomb. Therefore, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara is not just the first pyramid. It is the monument that marks the moment when human ambition in stone became something genuinely new in the world, when one person's decision to build bigger and taller and in a different material set in motion a chain of consequences that would eventually produce the Great Pyramid and everything that followed it. One of the most visually distinctive pyramids in all of Egypt sits at a place called Dashur, and it is called the Bent Pyramid for a reason that becomes immediately obvious the moment you see it. The angle of its sides changes partway up, shifting from a steep 54 degrees at the base to a shallower 43 degrees near the top, giving it a kinked and compressed profile that looks almost like a pyramid that changed its mind halfway through its own construction. But this change in angle was not decorative or intentional in the way the word design usually implies. It was almost certainly an emergency response to a structural problem that developed during construction, a moment when the builders looked at what they were making and realized that if they continued at the original angle, the pyramid might not hold together long enough to be finished, let alone last for eternity. Therefore, somewhere in the middle of building the Bent Pyramid, the people responsible for it made a decision that has been preserved in stone for 4,500 years. They chose pragmatism over perfection, adjusted their angle, and finished the structure in a form that would stand, rather than a form that would collapse beautifully. But the Bent Pyramid is not a failure. It is, in the vocabulary of engineering history, a prototype, a learning moment in the centuries-long process by which Egyptian architects worked out the mathematics of pyramid construction through trial and experience, rather than through pre-existing theory. Therefore, the Bent Pyramid represents something that the smooth and perfect Great Pyramid cannot quite show us. The process, the uncertainty, the moment of doubt and adjustment that lies behind every great achievement, the evidence that even the most ambitious builders in history sometimes had to stop and recalculate. But there is also something quietly beautiful about the Bent Pyramid's imperfection. It is the only major pyramid that shows its own thinking, that preserves in its shape the moment when its builders were still learning, still working out the answer to a problem that no one had solved before them. Therefore, standing before the bent pyramid and looking at the angle change written into its stone, you are not looking at a mistake. You are looking at the exact moment when the ancient Egyptians were figuring out how to build the pyramids that would come after it, the rough draft of a perfection they had not yet achieved but were already reaching toward. Inside several of the oldest pyramids in Egypt, carved into the stone walls of burial chambers and corridors in careful and elegant hieroglyphs, are texts so ancient that they predate almost every other major piece of religious writing in the world. But these pyramid texts, as researchers call them, are not simply decorations or labels. They are a complete and sophisticated theological document, a collection of spells, prayers, hymns, and instructions designed to guide the soul of the pharaoh through the dangers and transitions of the afterlife and ensure its safe arrival among the gods. The oldest complete collection of pyramid texts was found inside the pyramid of a pharaoh named Unas, who ruled Egypt around 2375 BCE, and the walls of his burial chamber are covered floor to ceiling in columns of hieroglyphs painted in blue-green pigment that still holds its color after 4,500 years of sealed darkness. Therefore, when the burial chamber of Unas was opened and the lights were brought in, the researchers who entered it were surrounded on every wall by words, by the oldest religious literature on earth, still legible, still present, still making its argument for the survival of the soul in the silence of a room that had not heard a human voice since the day it was sealed. But the pyramid texts are not simple or naive documents. They describe a cosmology of great complexity, with multiple competing versions of the afterlife existing simultaneously, with the soul taking different forms and traveling through different realms, depending on which set of spells accompanied it into death. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians who wrote these texts were not primitive people with simple beliefs, but sophisticated thinkers who had developed a theology as layered and internally consistent as any that would come after it, preserved not in a library that could burn, but in stone that could last effectively forever. But reading the pyramid texts today, even in translation, even stripped of the resonance of their original language, there is something in them that does not feel entirely distant or foreign, something in the basic wish they express, the wish that consciousness should continue, that the individual should not simply end, that feels recognizably and permanently human. Therefore, the pyramid texts are not just the oldest religious writings in the world, they are one of the oldest surviving expressions of the most universal human question, written in stone by people who believe deeply enough in their answer to carve it into the walls of a tomb and seal it inside a pyramid built to last for eternity. Many of the pyramids built by the ancient Egyptians were not simple solitary structures rising alone from the desert floor. They were the centerpieces of vast and carefully planned architectural complexes that spread across the landscape in multiple directions, connected by causeways, surrounded by temples, and accompanied by smaller satellite structures whose purposes ranged from practical to deeply spiritual. But the most surprising of these accompanying structures, and the one that takes the longest to fully absorb, is what archaeologists call the boat pit, a long, narrow trench cut into the bedrock beside the pyramid, and fitted with a wooden boat, sealed inside and preserved for the journey of the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife. In 1954, a perfectly preserved cedar boat was discovered in a sealed pit beside the Great Pyramid of Giza, 1,400 individual pieces of Lebanese cedar, still smelling faintly of wood after 4,500 years in the sealed pit, which were carefully reassembled over years of painstaking work into a vessel 43 meters long that is now displayed in a museum built directly over the spot where it was found. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians buried a full-sized ocean-going vessel beside their pyramid, not as a symbol or a model, but as an actual functional boat, ready for a voyage that they believed was as real and necessary as any voyage across the Nile, the journey of the soul across the sky, following the path of the sun from east to west and then back again through the underworld before rising once more at dawn. But 5 other boat pits have been identified around the Great Pyramid alone, suggesting that the pharaoh's afterlife journey required not one boat, but an entire fleet. outfitted for different legs of a cosmic journey, whose full itinerary was mapped out in the religious texts carved into the walls of other pyramids nearby. Therefore, the complex around the Great Pyramid was not a tomb in the limited sense we might imagine. It was an entire infrastructure for eternity, a fully equipped departure point for a journey that the Egyptians believed would last forever, designed and built and stocked with the same care and thoroughness that any serious traveler would bring to packing for a very long trip. But the boat that was found is made of Lebanese cedar, wood that does not grow in Egypt and must have been imported across hundreds of kilometers, which means that even the materials for the afterlife journey were sourced with the same organizational reach and logistical ambition that characterized every other aspect of pyramid construction. Therefore, the boat beside the pyramid is not just an artifact. It is a window into a mind that took the afterlife completely seriously, that planned for it with practical thoroughness, and that saw no contradiction between the spiritual and the logistical, between believing in a cosmic journey and making absolutely sure the boat was seaworthy. The shadow cast by a pyramid is not a fixed or static thing. It moves through the day as the sun crosses the sky, shortens and lengthens through the year as the seasons change, and traces a slow and precise arc across the desert floor that the ancient Egyptians understood and used as a tool for measuring time with a reliability that required no machinery, no maintenance, and no power source beyond the sun itself. But the precision of the pyramid's orientation, its four sides aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, means that the shadows it casts are not random or approximate, but accurate enough to mark specific moments in the solar year, including the equinoxes, when the shadow falls in a particular way that is distinctly different from every other day, and the solstices, when the shadow reaches its longest and shortest extremes. Therefore, the Great Pyramid functioned as a kind of permanent and indestructible calendar, a sundial on an architectural scale built into the landscape in a way that would keep working for as long as the sun kept rising, which the Egyptians expected to be forever. But the calendar function of the pyramid was not separate from its religious and funerary function. In ancient Egyptian theology, time itself was sacred, the cycles of the sun were divine, and the ability to measure those cycles accurately was not merely practical, but an act of participation in the order of the universe. Therefore, the pyramid stood at the intersection of the practical and the divine, in the same way that all great Egyptian architecture did. It was simultaneously a tomb, a star map, a calendar, a theological statement, a feat of engineering, and a permanent landmark. And none of these functions contradicted or diminished the others, because in the ancient Egyptian mind, they were all expressions of the same underlying truth. But what is quietly remarkable about the shadow function of the pyramid is how accessible it is. You do not need to enter the pyramid or understand its internal geometry to experience it. You simply need to stand beside it on the right day and watch the shadow move, which is something any person at any point in the last 4,500 years could have done. Therefore, the pyramid shares something with every person who has ever stood near it in daylight. The same shadow, the same slow movement, the same sun tracing the same arc across the same sky. And in that shared experience, there is a continuity that no amount of time or change has been able to interrupt. After more than 4,000 years of desert heat, cold nights, occasional earthquakes, centuries of stone removal, the footsteps of millions of tourists, and the slow chemical work of wind and moisture on ancient limestone, the pyramids of Giza still stand. But this fact, stated plainly, does not quite carry the weight it deserves. The pyramids were built before the wheel was in common use in Egypt, before iron tools existed anywhere in the world, before writing had developed into the sophisticated system it would later become, and they have outlasted every empire, every religion, every language, and every political system that has risen and fallen in the 4,500 years since the last stone was placed. Therefore, the pyramids are not just old. They are old in a way that makes almost everything else humans have ever built seem temporary by comparison, a quality of permanence that was not accidental but deliberately achieved by people who understood that they were building for eternity and made every decision accordingly. But the pyramids have also changed. They are shorter now than they were originally. Their smooth white casing is gone. Their golden capstones are missing. Their entrance doors are broken open. and the city that grew up around them has come so close that from certain angles, the pyramids appear to rise directly from the suburbs of Cairo, surrounded by apartment buildings and traffic rather than open desert. Therefore, the pyramids exist today in a strange double state. They are simultaneously the most intact major structures from the ancient world and profoundly altered from what they once were, recognizable enough to be instantly iconic and different enough from their original form that no living person has ever seen them as they were meant to be seen. But something essential remains, something that survives the missing casing stones and the broken capstones and the tourist queues and the centuries of slow erosion, a quality in the stone itself, in the sheer scale and stillness of the structures, that continues to produce in almost every person who stands near them a feeling that is difficult to name but impossible to mistake. Therefore, the pyramids endure not only as physical structures but as experiences, as places where the distance between the present and the ancient past collapses just enough to be felt, where the human mind touches something so large and so old that it grows briefly quiet, the way it grows quiet in the presence of the ocean or the night sky or any other thing that is simply too large and too patient to argue with. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara holds a distinction that no other structure in Egypt can claim. It is the oldest large stone building in the world, the first time human beings decided to stack cut stone blocks on top of each other at a scale large enough to be called monumental, and the first time a single architectural vision was carried through from foundation to peak in a material designed to outlast the person who commissioned it. But before Imhotep made his series of decisions that turned a flat mastaba into a six-tiered pyramid, every important building in Egypt was made of mud brick, a material that was abundant and workable but fundamentally impermanent, a material that dissolved back into the earth within centuries, leaving behind only traces and impressions rather than the thing itself. Therefore, the decision to build in stone was not just a practical choice, but a philosophical one, a statement that this particular structure, this particular burial, this particular pharaoh deserved to exist in a form that would not dissolve, would not crumble, would not return quietly to the ground, but would instead remain standing for as long as the stone held together. But Imhotep did not arrive at the step pyramid in a single flash of inspiration. He built it in stages, each stage a response to the previous one, expanding and raising the structure until it reached a height and a form that satisfied whatever vision he was working toward. Which means the pyramid we see today is the record of a mind working through a problem in real time, in stone, at enormous scale. Therefore, the step pyramid is simultaneously a finished monument and a visible process. You can see in its layers the sequence of decisions that produced it, the way each level responds to and builds upon the one below, which is something the later smooth-sided pyramids, with their seamless surfaces, deliberately conceal. But what Imhotep achieved at Saqqara rippled forward through centuries of Egyptian history, establishing the basic grammar of monumental stone construction that every subsequent pyramid builder would inherit, refine, and eventually perfect in the smooth-sided monuments at Giza. Therefore, standing before the step pyramid today is standing before the beginning of a very long story, the first sentence of a conversation in stone that Egypt would continue for nearly 1,000 years, a conversation about permanence and ambition and the human refusal to accept that important things must eventually disappear. Among all the pyramids built by the ancient Egyptians, the one that raises the most questions and offers the fewest answers is the smallest of the three at Giza, the Pyramid of Menkaure, which stands at the southern end of the Giza Plateau and presents to every researcher who examines it the same quiet and unanswerable mystery. But the mystery is not in its exterior, which is well understood and carefully documented, but in its interior, specifically in its burial chamber, which was found completely empty when explorers first reached it in the 19th century. No mummy, no coffin, no burial goods, no inscription explaining what happened, just bare stone and silence in a room that was built at extraordinary cost and effort to hold something that is no longer there. Therefore, the entire purpose of the Pyramid of Menkaure, the reason tens of thousands of people spent decades of their lives cutting and moving and placing millions of tons of stone, was a burial that either never happened as planned was disturbed so completely that no trace remains, or was removed so carefully and so long ago that the archaeological record holds no clear memory of it. But a granite sarcophagus was found inside the pyramid in the 19th century, which suggested that a burial had at least been prepared, and the sarcophagus was loaded onto a ship to be transported to England, where it was intended for a museum. But the ship sank in the Mediterranean Sea, and the sarcophagus now rests on the ocean floor, adding one more layer of mystery and loss to a monument that seems almost deliberately to withhold its secrets. Therefore, the Pyramid of Menkaure stands as a reminder that not every ancient question has an answer waiting to be found. Some structures were built to last forever and then lost their meaning before forever arrived, leaving behind only the stone and the silence and the shape of an intention whose content has been erased. But the pyramid itself is not diminished by this emptiness. If anything, the absence of its pharaoh makes it more present as a structure, more available as a thing to simply stand beside and look at, unmediated by the weight of a specific story or the distraction of a known ending. Therefore, the Pyramid of Menkaure is in some ways the most honest of the three great pyramids at Giza. It stands without its explanation, without its justification, without its intended occupant, holding its shape against the sky with the same patience as its neighbors, as if it has long since made peace with the fact that the reason for its existence has been quietly lost to time. When the ancient Egyptians completed the outer casing of a pyramid, that smooth, brilliant surface of polished white limestone that once made the monuments shine like mirrors across the desert, they were not simply finishing a building in the way a modern construction crew applies a final coat of paint, but they were covering the pyramid in a material that held specific theological significance, because white in ancient Egyptian symbolism was the color of purity, of light, of the divine realm where the gods existed beyond the reach of ordinary human experience. And clothing the pyramid in white stone was therefore an act of consecration, a way of transforming a human construction into something that participated in the sacred order of the universe. Therefore, the casing stones were not just a surface treatment, but a statement, a declaration that the structure beneath them had crossed a threshold and become something more than architecture, something that existed simultaneously in the physical world and in the symbolic world that the ancient Egyptians inhabited, with the same ease that modern people inhabit the world of digital screens and invisible networks. But the casing stones are almost entirely gone now, removed over centuries, beginning in the 13th century CE, when a massive earthquake loosened many of them from the pyramid's face, and local rulers ordered them collected and used as building material for mosques, bridges, and the expanding city of Cairo. Therefore, the white limestone of the pyramids now exists in a distributed form, scattered through the walls of medieval buildings across Cairo, present in streets and foundations and monuments that most people walk past without knowing they are touching the skin of something 4,000 years old. But there is something unexpectedly moving about this distribution. The pyramid gave its surface to a city that grew up in its shadow, its stones becoming part of the daily life of millions of people who may never think about where the material beneath their feet originally came from. Therefore, the pyramids are, in a quiet and literal way, still present in Cairo, not only on the plateau at Giza, where their cores still stand, but dissolved into the fabric of the city itself, their white limestone holding up walls and floors and archways, still doing the work of building, still carrying weight, still participating in the life of human civilization, just in a form that no longer shines. Deep within the limestone plateau of Giza, beneath the pyramids and the Sphinx and the temples and the wide open spaces where tourists walk and take photographs, there is a world that most visitors never think about. A network of tunnels, shafts, chambers, and passages cut into the bedrock by the ancient Egyptians for purposes that are still not entirely clear to the researchers who have spent careers trying to map and understand them. But the underground geography of Giza is not just a curiosity. It is a reminder that what we see on the surface of the pyramid plateau is only the most visible part of a much larger and more complex sacred landscape, one that extended both upward into the sky through the pyramid's height and downward into the earth through shafts and chambers whose full extent has not yet been determined. Therefore, the Giza Plateau is not a flat stage on which three pyramids happen to stand. It is a three-dimensional monument that uses both the rock above the ground and the rock below it, treating the entire limestone formation as material to be shaped and organized according to a plan that encompassed heaven, earth, and everything beneath the earth simultaneously. But some of the underground passages at Giza lead to destinations that researchers have not yet fully explored. Shafts that narrow or collapse before they can be followed to their ends. Chambers that have been identified by ground-penetrating radar but not yet excavated. Spaces that exist in the data but not yet in human experience. Therefore, beneath one of the most visited and most studied places on Earth, there are rooms that no modern person has entered, passages that no modern light has illuminated, and possibly objects or inscriptions that have been waiting in the dark for 4,000 years for someone to come and read them. But the excavation of these underground spaces is complicated by the presence of the pyramids above them. Any digging risks disturbing the foundations of structures that have survived millennia precisely because no one has disturbed them, which means the choice between discovery and preservation is a genuine and difficult one. Therefore, the underground Giza remains one of the last great mysteries of a site that has been studied longer and more intensively than almost any other place on Earth. A reminder that the pyramids are not a closed book, but an open question, and that the ground beneath our feet in some of the most familiar places still holds things we have not yet found. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the specific quality of light that falls in the early morning, a quality they associated with the divine, with beginnings, with the moment when the boundary between the human world and the world of the gods was thinnest and most permeable. But they did not just describe this quality of light in their poetry and their prayers. They built it into their architecture, orienting the temples and pyramids and causeways of the Giza complex so that the rising sun on specific important days of the year would enter particular spaces, illuminate particular walls, fall on particular statues in ways that were not accidental but precisely engineered to happen at exactly the right moment. Therefore, the Giza complex is not just a collection of buildings that happen to face east. It is a carefully calibrated light machine designed to participate in the daily and yearly drama of the sun in ways that require generations of astronomical observation to plan and decades of construction to execute. But the most dramatic example of this solar alignment is not at Giza, but at a temple called Abu Simbel, further south along the Nile, where twice a year, on the anniversary of Ramesses II's birth and his coronation, the rising sun penetrates the entire length of the temple and illuminates the faces of 4 statues at the far end, including the face of Ramesses himself, while leaving the statue of the god of the underworld beside him in deliberate darkness. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians were not simply aware of the sun's movements. They were in active conversation with those movements, building structures that responded to the sun the way musical instruments respond to the hands of a player, producing specific effects at specific moments that were planned centuries in advance. But what is remarkable about these solar alignments is how precisely they have held over thousands of years. The sun still enters Abu Simbel at the right angle on the right days, still illuminates the faces that were meant to receive it, because the Earth's relationship to the sun changes slowly enough that what was true 4,000 years ago is still true today. Therefore, every time the sun enters one of these ancient spaces and falls exactly where it was designed to fall, it completes a circuit that was opened 4,000 years ago, a connection between an ancient intention and a present moment, achieved through nothing more complicated than stone and light and the slow, reliable turning of the earth. The pyramids that most people picture when they hear the word, smooth-sided, geometrically perfect, rising to a single point, represent not the beginning of Egyptian pyramid building but its peak, a perfection achieved after more than a century of experimentation, failure, adjustment, and learning from mistakes that were sometimes catastrophic enough to threaten the entire project. But the path from the step pyramid of Djoser to the Great Pyramid of Khufu runs through several intermediate structures that show the process of development with unusual clarity. The bent pyramid, which changed its angle midway through construction. The red pyramid, which was the first successful true pyramid with smooth sides, and several collapsed or abandoned pyramids that marked the moments when the learning curve was steepest and the consequences of miscalculation were most severe. Therefore, the history of pyramid building in Egypt is not a story of sudden genius, but of iterative engineering, a process of building, observing, measuring, adjusting, and building again that stretched across generations and required the transmission of technical knowledge from one team of builders to the next, across decades and sometimes centuries of continuous effort. But this process of learning is written in the landscape. If you drive south from Giza along the Nile and visit the pyramid sites in historical sequence, you can read the development of the builders understanding the way you might read chapters in a book, each structure representing a new attempt to solve problems identified in the previous one. Therefore, the Great Pyramid is not a standalone miracle, but the final answer to a question that Egyptian architects had been working on for over a century, the culmination of a research and development process conducted entirely in stone, at enormous scale, under the pressure of royal expectation and religious necessity. But what makes this developmental history remarkable is that each failed or imperfect pyramid was still completed and used. The bent pyramid still served as a tomb. The stepped pyramids still functioned as monuments, because the Egyptians understood that an imperfect answer to the right question was still better than no answer at all. Therefore, the pyramids in their sequence tell a story about human persistence and collective learning that is, in its own way, as impressive as any individual structure. The story of a civilization that decided to do something enormously difficult, kept doing it despite setbacks, and eventually produced something so close to perfect that the world is still talking about it 4,500 years later. Beside the pyramids of Giza, partially buried in the sand that has drifted around it for millennia, crouches the largest and oldest monumental sculpture in the world. The Great Sphinx, a lion's body with a human head, carved directly from the living limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau rather than assembled from separate blocks. But the Sphinx raises a question that Egyptologists have been debating for decades with unusual intensity. How old is it, exactly? And who built it? And why does the answer to that question matter so much to so many people who study ancient history? The conventional answer places the construction of the Sphinx at around 2500 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, whose pyramid it faces. But a geologist named Robert Schoch proposed in the 1990s that the pattern of erosion on the Sphinx's body looks more like the erosion caused by heavy rainfall than by wind and sand, and that the last time Egypt received rainfall heavy enough to produce that pattern was before 5000 BCE, which would make the Sphinx thousands of years older than the pyramids beside it. Therefore, if Schoch's geological argument is correct, and it remains controversial, disputed by many Egyptologists while supported by some geologists, the Sphinx may be the oldest monumental sculpture on Earth by a very wide margin, a survivor from a period of Egyptian or pre-Egyptian civilization that left almost no other trace in the archaeological record. But the face of the Sphinx has also attracted attention, because it does not look quite like the faces depicted on other statues of Khafre. It is more weathered, more eroded, and some researchers have suggested it may have been recarved at some point, the original face replaced with a new one, as the monument changed owners or meanings across the centuries. Therefore, the Sphinx sits beside the pyramids as the most enigmatic member of an already mysterious group, the one that refuses most stubbornly to give up its full story, the one whose origins remain genuinely uncertain despite the proximity of so much other well-documented ancient material. But in that refusal there is something almost characterful. The Sphinx has been watching the desert for longer than anyone can say with certainty, has been buried and excavated and studied and argued over, and still keeps its expression of calm and patient attention, as if it knows something about time that its investigators have not yet figured out. Therefore, every theory about the Sphinx is still, in some sense, provisional. The conversation about what it is, and when it was made, and who made it, is ongoing, which means the Sphinx is not a solved mystery but a living question, still asking something of everyone who comes close enough to look it in the face. The ancient world produced many remarkable buildings, but the pyramids of Giza belong to a category of achievement that even the most sophisticated ancient civilizations recognized as extraordinary. They appear on the ancient list known as the Seven Wonders of the World, a catalog of the most impressive human constructions compiled by Greek scholars around the 2nd century BCE. But what makes the pyramids' presence on this list remarkable is not that they were included. Their inclusion is unsurprising given their scale, but that they are the only item on the list that still exists, the only wonder that survived long enough to be photographed, measured, excavated, and visited by the tourists of a civilization that the ancient Greeks could not have imagined. Therefore, every other wonder of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Temple of Artemis, the Statue of Zeus, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, exists now only in descriptions and reconstructions, in the imagination of historians and the digital renderings of architects who have tried to guess at their appearance from fragmentary textual evidence. But the pyramids stand, solid and measurable and physically present, available to anyone who travels to Giza and looks at them with their own eyes. Which means that the only way to truly understand the difference between the pyramids and the other 6 wonders is to stand in front of one and feel the scale of it, something no photograph has ever quite managed to convey, and no description has ever quite captured. Therefore, the pyramids occupy a unique position in human history. They are not just the greatest surviving monument of the ancient world, but the only point of direct physical contact between the modern world and the list of the greatest achievements of antiquity. The one place where a living person can stand and say with certainty that they are looking at exactly what the ancient Greeks were looking at when they called it a wonder. But the word wonder in this context carries its original meaning. Not admiration exactly, but something closer to bewilderment. The feeling of encountering something that exceeds your capacity to explain it. Therefore, the pyramids have been producing that feeling continuously for 4,500 years. Through every civilization and every century that has come and gone in the long time since they were built, and they show no particular sign of stopping. The limestone plateau on which the pyramids of Giza were built was not chosen randomly or simply because it was available. The ancient Egyptians selected it with the same care and deliberateness they applied to every other aspect of pyramid construction, and the reasons for their choice reveal how integrated their practical and spiritual thinking was. But the plateau offered something that a construction engineer of any era would value immediately: solid bedrock close to the surface, capable of bearing the enormous weight of millions of tons of stone without settling or shifting over time. A foundation stable enough to support structures designed to last for eternity. Therefore, the bedrock of Giza has been carrying the pyramids for 4,500 years without significant movement, which is a geological feat that required both the right kind of rock and the ancient Egyptians' ability to recognize and choose it, an ability that implies a practical understanding of geology that they never wrote down in any surviving text but clearly possessed and applied. But the plateau also offered something theologically important. Its position on the west bank of the Nile placed it in the land of the setting sun, the direction associated in Egyptian cosmology with death and the afterlife, which made it the appropriate location for tombs and funerary monuments in a way that the east bank, associated with the rising sun and the living world, was not. Therefore, the choice of Giza was simultaneously a geological decision and a cosmological one. The site was chosen because the rock was right and because the direction was right, because the practical and the sacred pointed to the same place, which is the kind of convergence the ancient Egyptians seem to have found more often than chance would suggest. But what the plateau also offered was visibility. The pyramids built there could be seen from an enormous distance in every direction, across the flat delta landscape, across the Nile, across the desert, making them landmarks that oriented the entire region around their presence. Therefore, the Giza Plateau was not just a building site, but a statement about the relationship between the dead and the living, between the west and the east, between the earth below and the sky above. A statement written in the most permanent material available and placed where it could not be missed by anyone approaching from any direction, which is exactly the kind of statement the ancient Egyptians were always trying to make. The pyramids of ancient Egypt were never meant to stand alone in the landscape as isolated monuments. They were always the centerpiece of a much larger and more carefully planned complex that included temples, causeways, smaller pyramids, boat pits, and administrative buildings that together formed a complete city of the dead. But the causeways that connected the valley temples at the edge of the Nile to the mortuary temples at the base of each pyramid were not simple roads. They were covered, enclosed passages decorated with painted and carved reliefs that told the story of the pharaoh's life, his divine nature, and his journey into the afterlife, which means that the procession from the river to the pyramid was itself a ritual experience, a moving through images and words that prepared both the body and the soul for what was waiting at the end of the path. Therefore, the pyramid complex was not a building but a sequence, a carefully designed series of spaces and transitions that moved a person from the ordinary world of the living into an increasingly sacred and concentrated atmosphere, each stage of the journey more charged with meaning than the last. But almost none of these causeways and valley temples survive in a condition that gives a full sense of what they once looked like. Most are heavily eroded, partially excavated, or buried under modern construction, leaving the pyramids standing above ground while the full context of their meaning lies fragmented and incomplete around them. Therefore, to see the pyramids without understanding the complexes they anchored is to see only the most visible part of something much larger, like seeing only the steeple of a cathedral, while the nave, the transepts, the cloisters, and the gardens remain hidden underground. But the fragments that do survive are remarkable enough to suggest what the whole must have been. Painted walls still holding color, granite floors still polished smooth, alabaster basins still holding the shape of the offerings they once received. Therefore, the pyramid complex at its peak was not a silent and empty desert monument, but a living center of ritual activity, staffed by priests, supplied by estates, visited by pilgrims, and maintained for generations after the pharaoh's death, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was managed daily, with care and intention, by people who believed that keeping that boundary permeable was one of the most important things a civilization could do. The pyramids of Egypt were built during a period when the Nile River flooded predictably every year, covering the agricultural land on both sides with a thick layer of nutrient-rich silt that made the soil extraordinarily fertile and productive for the months that followed. But this annual flood also created something that pyramid builders relied on just as much as the fertile soil: a seasonal workforce, because the flooding made farming impossible for several months each year, leaving tens of thousands of agricultural workers with no fields to tend and no crops to manage, available to be organized and directed toward the enormous construction projects that the pharaoh needed completed. Therefore, the pyramid was not built despite the Nile flood, but because of it. The annual rhythm of the river created the conditions that made large-scale organized labor possible, providing both the workers and the logistical window during which the heaviest stones could be floated on high water closer to the construction site. But this connection between the flood and the pyramid means that the monument is, in a very literal sense, a product of the Egyptian landscape, shaped not just by the ambition of pharaohs and the skill of architects, but by the specific behavior of a river that flooded on a reliable schedule and fed a population large enough and organized enough to build something of this scale. Therefore, the Great Pyramid is inseparable from the Nile, in the same way that a tree is inseparable from the soil it grew in. The river made the food that fed the workers, made the water that eased the transport, made the seasonal pause that freed the labor, and made the agricultural surplus that funded the entire operation from beginning to end. But the Nile no longer floods in the same way. The construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century ended the annual inundation that had defined Egyptian life for thousands of years, changing the river's relationship to the land permanently and irrevocably. Therefore, the condition that made the pyramids possible no longer exists, which means the pyramids are not just monuments to the ambition of ancient Egypt, but to a specific and unrepeatable set of natural circumstances. A particular river behaving in a particular way at a particular moment in history, creating a window of possibility that opened and closed and will never open again in quite the same form. Inside the Great Pyramid, running at precise angles through the body of the monument from the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber upward toward the pyramid's outer face, are 4 narrow passages that Egyptologists initially classified as ventilation shafts, practical channels designed to move air through the sealed interior and keep the burial chambers from becoming dangerously stagnant. But this explanation began to unravel when researchers measured the angles of the shafts carefully and projected their trajectories outward into the night sky, because the angles did not point randomly or practically. They pointed at specific stars that held deep significance in ancient Egyptian cosmology, with a precision that required astronomical knowledge and deliberate engineering to achieve. The northern shaft of the king's chamber pointed toward Thuban, the star that occupied the position of the north celestial pole at the time the pyramid was built, the fixed point around which the entire sky appeared to rotate, associated in Egyptian theology with immortality because it never set below the horizon. Therefore, the shaft from the pharaoh's burial chamber pointed directly at the star that the ancient Egyptians associated with eternal existence, a permanent, open, stone-lined pathway from the room where the pharaoh's body rested to the one point in the sky that never disappeared, never descended, never died. But the southern shaft of the king's chamber pointed toward Orion's belt, specifically toward the star Alnitak, the lowest of the three belt stars, which was associated with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, whose story was the central myth of the Egyptian afterlife. Therefore, the pharaoh's burial chamber was aimed simultaneously at immortality in the north and resurrection in the south, the two great promises of Egyptian religion built into the geometry of the room itself, encoded in angles of stone that would hold their alignment for as long as the pyramid stood. But the shafts are too narrow to walk through, too narrow even to fully illuminate with a handheld torch. They are not passages for human bodies, but for something the Egyptians believed needed no physical form to travel, something that could move through stone the way light moves through water. Therefore, the shafts are perhaps the most intimate and personal architecture in the entire pyramid, not the grand chambers or the soaring galleries, but these four narrow tunnels aimed at specific stars, built by people who believed that the soul of their king needed a road to the sky, and who cut that road precisely and permanently into 4,500 years of solid stone. When archaeologists excavated the workers' village at Giza and began analyzing the bones found in the cemetery, they discovered something that quietly dismantled one of the most persistent images associated with pyramid construction: the image of broken, exhausted bodies destroyed by impossible labor under brutal conditions. But the bones told a different story, or at least a more complicated one. Yes, they showed the kind of wear and stress that accumulates in a body doing heavy physical work over many years, including healed fractures, worn joints, and the skeletal markers of repeated heavy lifting. But they also showed something unexpected: evidence of surgical intervention, of broken bones that had been set and splinted and that healed correctly, of amputations that had been performed and survived, of medical care sophisticated enough to keep injured workers alive and functional in a world without antibiotics or modern surgical tools. Therefore, the pyramid builders had doctors, actual, practicing physicians who understood enough about the human body to perform procedures that worked, whose patients survived and returned to work and lived long enough to develop the healed bone that the archaeologists found thousands of years later. But ancient Egyptian medicine was not guesswork or ritual alone. The Egyptians produced some of the earliest known medical texts in history, including the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describes surgical procedures with a clinical precision and a rational approach to diagnosis that reads, in places, more like a modern medical textbook than an ancient religious document. Therefore, the workers who built the pyramids were living inside one of the most medically advanced civilizations of the ancient world, and that advancement was available to them, not just to the pharaoh and the priests, but to the ordinary men carrying stones across the desert, whose broken arms were set and whose infected wounds were treated by physicians who had inherited centuries of accumulated medical knowledge. But the bones also show something that no medical record could convey as directly: the sheer physical reality of the work, the way it accumulated in the skeleton over years and decades, the permanent marks it left on the bodies of people who gave their physical prime to the construction of something they would never fully see completed, and would never be able to explain to their grandchildren in terms those grandchildren could easily imagine. Therefore, the cemetery beside the Great Pyramid is not just an archaeological site, but a library of bodies, a collection of physical records written in bone by people who could not have known they were writing anything, whose skeletons have now told us more about their daily lives than any inscription they left behind. The question of how the ancient Egyptians moved the enormous stone blocks of the pyramids from the quarry to the construction site and then upward to their final position in the growing structure is one that has occupied engineers, historians, and enthusiastic amateurs for centuries, producing a remarkable variety of proposed solutions that range from the sensible to the spectacular. But no single explanation has ever achieved universal acceptance, because the direct evidence for the construction method, the ramps, the sledges, the organizational systems, has not survived in a complete enough form to settle the debate, leaving researchers to argue from partial evidence, experimental archaeology, and the occasional ancient painting or model that offers tantalizing but incomplete clues. The most widely accepted theory involves ramps, long, sloping earthen or mud brick structures built against the pyramid's face that workers used to drag stone blocks upward on sledges, the ramp growing longer and shallower as the pyramid grew taller. Therefore, the pyramid was, during its construction, surrounded by an enormous infrastructure of ramps and scaffolding and supply routes that may have been as impressive in its own way as the monument itself. A temporary city of logistics that was dismantled and removed so completely after the pyramid was finished that almost nothing of it remains. But the ramp theory has a mathematical problem. A straight ramp, long enough and shallow enough to be practical for the upper portions of the pyramid, would have required more material to build than the pyramid itself contains, which means either the ramp was designed differently than the simple straight version usually depicted, or the upper portions of the pyramid were built using a different method entirely. Therefore, some researchers have proposed internal ramps, spiraling passages built inside the body of the pyramid as it rose, later sealed with the final casing stones. And a French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin has developed a detailed computer model showing how this could have worked. A model that matches some of the internal features of the Great Pyramid in ways that conventional ramp theories do not fully explain. But the internal ramp theory also remains unproven, because testing it would require either finding direct physical evidence inside the pyramid or developing non-invasive scanning technology sensitive enough to distinguish a filled-in ramp from solid stone. Therefore, the construction of the Great Pyramid remains, after centuries of study and decades of modern scientific investigation, an open question, not because the answer is supernatural or impossible, but because the evidence is incomplete, which is perhaps the most honest kind of mystery there is, the kind that keeps the conversation going without pretending it has been resolved. The ancient Egyptians believed that the human being was composed of multiple distinct elements that existed simultaneously and served different functions both in life and in death, not simply a body and a soul in the binary way that many modern traditions conceive of the self, but a more complex assembly of components that each required specific care and attention to ensure the individual's survival and well-being in the afterlife. But the pyramid, and the entire funerary complex surrounding it, was designed with all of these components in mind. It was not just a container for a body, but a complete support system for every aspect of what the Egyptians believed a person to be, engineered to maintain and protect each element through the indefinite duration of eternity. The physical body was preserved through mummification, protected in a sarcophagus, enclosed in a burial chamber, surrounded by the mass of the pyramid, layer after layer of protection for the material form that the soul would need to return to during the day. Therefore, the pyramid's primary practical function was preservation, keeping the body intact long enough for the soul to complete its journeys through the afterlife and return to find its home still recognizable, still whole, still capable of receiving the returning consciousness that belonged to it. But the other components of the person required different provisions. The Kai, a kind of life force or double, needed food and drink offerings brought regularly to the mortuary temple, which is why the pyramid complex included a fully staffed temple where priests made daily offerings for generations after the pharaoh's death. Therefore, the pyramid was not a one-time construction project, but the foundation of an ongoing institution, a permanent endowment, funded by agricultural estates and administered by hereditary priesthoods, designed to maintain the offerings and rituals that the dead pharaoh needed indefinitely. But this institution, like all institutions, eventually ran out of resources or political support. The estates were absorbed, the priesthoods died out, the offerings stopped, and the pharaohs whose pyramids once had full ritual staffs eventually found themselves alone in their stone chambers with no one bringing bread to the temple outside. Therefore, the pyramid outlasted the institution it was built to support, which is one of the quieter ironies of ancient Egypt. The most permanent part of the funerary system was the stone, and the most important part, the daily human attention and care, was the first thing to disappear, leaving the pyramid standing in the desert, perfectly intact, waiting for offerings that stopped arriving somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years after the last stone was placed. Among all the things that make the Great Pyramid remarkable, its size, its precision, its age, its alignment. One of the most quietly astonishing is the quality of the stonework in its interior chambers, particularly in the King's Chamber, where the walls are lined with enormous blocks of red Aswan granite that fit together with a closeness and accuracy that modern stonemasons openly describe as extraordinary, even by contemporary standards. But the granite used in the King's Chamber is one of the hardest stones on earth. It sits near the top of the hardness scale, resistant to scratching, resistant to cutting, resistant to the kind of precise shaping that the finished blocks clearly required. And the ancient Egyptians did not have steel or iron tools capable of working it in the way modern masons would approach the problem. Therefore, the Egyptians cut, shaped, and finished enormous blocks of extremely hard granite, using tools made primarily of copper, a metal significantly softer than the stone it was being used to work, along with abrasive sand, wooden mallets, and a patient systematic approach to material removal that achieved results the hardness differential makes difficult to explain. But the precision of the finished surfaces is measurable. The granite blocks in the King's Chamber fit together with gaps of less than 0.5 millimeter in places, across surfaces that are flat to a degree that required either extraordinary skill, extraordinary tools, or both. And researchers who have attempted to replicate this precision using period-accurate copper tools have consistently struggled to match the original quality. Therefore, there is a genuine and unresolved gap between what we know the ancient Egyptians had available in terms of tools and materials, and what the physical evidence of their finished work demonstrates they were capable of producing. A gap that is not large enough to require supernatural explanation, but is large enough to require a better explanation than the ones currently available. But this gap is, in its own way, one of the most interesting things about the pyramids. It is a place where the evidence exceeds the theory, where the physical reality of what was built is more impressive than our current understanding of how it was built, which means the pyramids are still, in a technical sense, ahead of us. Therefore, every researcher who measures the granite walls of the King's Chamber and finds them more precise than they should be by any calculation based on known ancient tools is receiving a quiet message from the past. Not a mysterious or supernatural message, but a practical one. The message that there is still something to understand, still a technique to recover, still a conversation between ancient knowledge and modern science that has not yet reached its conclusion. The story of how the pyramids came to be understood, misunderstood, explored, and studied by the modern world is itself a long and complicated history, full of characters whose motivations range from genuine scholarly curiosity to outright treasure hunting. But perhaps no single figure did more damage to the physical fabric of ancient Egyptian monuments in the name of exploration than Giovanni Belzoni, an Italian strongman turned adventurer who arrived in Egypt in the early 19th century and proceeded to blast, pry, and tunnel his way into monuments across the country with an enthusiasm that was entirely unchecked by any concept of archaeological preservation. Belzoni used battering rams to enter sealed chambers, dragged massive statues across the desert without adequate support, and approached the ancient monuments with the same directness he had previously applied to performing feats of strength in traveling circuses across Europe, which is to say, with great energy and very little delicacy. Therefore, many of the physical details of ancient monuments that modern researchers would most value, the undisturbed arrangement of a burial chamber, the intact seals of a sarcophagus, the original position of objects left by ancient hands, were destroyed by Belzoni and his contemporaries before anyone understood that those details were more valuable than the objects themselves. But Belzoni was also genuinely courageous in a physical sense. He crawled through passages filled with ancient debris, spent nights inside pyramids in conditions that were dangerous and deeply uncomfortable, and produced illustrated accounts of his explorations that introduced the monuments of ancient Egypt to a European public that had never seen anything like them. Therefore, his legacy is genuinely mixed, part destroyer, part discoverer, part showman, part explorer. A figure who belongs to a period when the line between archaeology and looting had not yet been drawn, and whose impact on the monuments he entered can still be seen in the broken seals and cleared chambers and missing artifacts that subsequent researchers have had to work around. But Belzoni's career also marks the beginning of the modern world's obsession with Egyptian monuments, the point at which the pyramids stopped being a distant marvel mentioned in travelers' accounts and became a subject of direct, physical, hands-on investigation by people who sailed to Egypt specifically to touch and measure and enter and understand them. Therefore, every archaeologist who has worked at Giza since Belzoni has worked in a world he helped create, a world where the pyramids are objects of active scientific study rather than passive wonder, where the questions are more precise and the methods are more careful, but where the basic human impulse that drives the work is the same one that drove him into those dark and ancient passages with a torch and a battering ram and an inexhaustible appetite for what might be waiting inside. The modern city of Cairo, home to over 20 million people and one of the largest and most densely populated urban areas in the world, has grown so large and so quickly over the past century that it has expanded right to the edge of the Giza Plateau, pressing up against the boundaries of the pyramid site in a way that would have been unimaginable to the people who built the monuments. But this proximity creates a visual experience that is, depending on how you feel about it, either deeply strange or quietly poetic. From certain angles and certain streets in the western suburbs of Cairo, you can see the pyramids rising above the apartment buildings and the traffic and the satellite dishes, ancient stone triangles floating above a modern city the way mountains float above a valley, enormous and indifferent and completely unchanged. Therefore, the pyramids exist today in a context that is unlike any other ancient monument on Earth, not isolated in a desert or a jungle or a remote valley, but pressed up against the edge of a living, breathing, enormously complicated modern metropolis, separated from millions of daily lives by nothing more than a road and a fence. But this adjacency also means that the pyramids are part of the daily visual landscape of millions of ordinary Cairenes, who are not tourists and not archaeologists. People who see the pyramids on their way to work, who grew up with them on the horizon, who have the kind of familiar and unremarkable relationship with one of the world's greatest monuments that only comes from living beside something your whole life. Therefore, the pyramids mean something different to someone who has seen them every morning since childhood than they mean to someone who has traveled thousands of miles to stand before them for the first time. A difference that is not about the pyramids themselves, but about the particular way familiarity and wonder relate to each other, and about how the most extraordinary things in the world become ordinary when they are simply always there. But extraordinary and ordinary are not opposites. They can occupy the same stone at the same time, which is what the pyramids do for the city that has grown up around them, being simultaneously the most ancient and the most present thing in the landscape, the oldest neighbors anyone in Cairo has ever had. Therefore, the pyramids of Giza are not just monuments to the ancient world. They are participants in the modern one, present in the daily life of a city that did not exist when they were built and will still be there, patient and unchanged, long after whatever comes next has risen and fallen and been replaced by something the present world cannot yet imagine. After 4,500 years of sunrises and sunsets, of seasons turning and stars shifting and civilizations rising and collapsing in the world beyond the desert, the pyramids of Giza remain standing on the same plateau where the ancient Egyptians placed them, in the same position, at the same angles, holding the same geometry against the same sky. But they are also, in important ways, not the same. The white casing is gone, the golden capstones are missing, the mortuary temples are reduced to foundations, the causeways are buried, the priests are long dead, the institutions that supported them have dissolved into history, and the civilization that built them and understood their full meaning no longer exists in any continuous form that connects directly to the present. Therefore, the pyramids exist in a state of simultaneous completeness and incompleteness, complete as structures, incomplete as monuments, present as stone, absent as meaning. standing exactly where they were placed while everything that was meant to surround and support and explain them has been removed by time. But the stone itself persists with a quality that nothing human-made of comparable age comes close to matching. It does not rust, does not rot, does not burn, does not dissolve in rain, does not yield to the biological processes that return most organic material to the earth within centuries, and it carries within it no mechanism for its own destruction, only the slow and patient endurance of mineral matter that measures time in geological rather than human terms. Therefore, the pyramids will still be standing when every building currently under construction in every city in the world has been demolished and replaced and demolished again. They will still be standing when the languages being spoken around them today have evolved into something unrecognizable, when the political entities that currently govern them have been replaced by others whose names have not yet been invented. But they will also, eventually, erode. The wind and the sand and the slow chemistry of water and atmosphere will continue their work across the millennia, rounding the edges, lowering the height, softening the geometry, until the pyramids become hills, and the hills become low mounds, and the low mounds become imperceptible rises in the desert floor, and the desert floor becomes whatever the earth decides to be next. Therefore, the pyramids are not eternal in the absolute sense. They are simply very, very patient, outlasting everything around them not through any special power, but through the simple and extraordinary virtue of being made of stone and placed carefully and left alone to do what stone does, which is to endure, quietly and without complaint, for as long as the world allows. The shadows that fall from the pyramids of Giza move slowly across the desert floor from morning to evening, tracing arcs that have been tracing themselves for 4,500 years across ground that has changed in almost every other way. But these shadows are not just the incidental effect of sunlight falling on large objects. They are, in a sense, the pyramid's most continuous activity, the one thing the monuments have been doing without interruption since the day the last stone was placed, the daily performance of a presence that requires no maintenance, no staff, no funding, and no human attention to continue indefinitely. Each morning the shadow falls long toward the west, shortening through the middle of the day until at noon. It pools almost directly beneath the pyramid's bulk, and then lengthens again toward the east as the afternoon advances, until the shadow stretches out across the desert in the last warm light before the sun goes down. Therefore, the pyramid shadow marks time with the same reliability and the same indifference that the Nile once marked the seasons. Not because it was designed to be a clock, though it functions as one, but simply because it is a large object in a sunny place, doing what large objects in sunny places have always done, which is to interrupt the light and cast their shape upon the ground. But the shadow of the Great Pyramid falls on ground that has been home to human beings for longer than almost any other inhabited place on Earth, ground that has known the footsteps of ancient quarry workers and Greek tourists and medieval Arab scholars and Napoleonic soldiers and Victorian explorers and 20th century archaeologists and 21st century visitors arriving by air from every country in the world. Therefore, the shadow connects all of these people across all of these centuries in the most physical and uncomplicated way possible. It falls on whoever is standing in it, without distinction, without preference, without any awareness of the extraordinary difference between the ancient Egyptian worker who first felt it 4,500 years ago and the person standing in it today, looking up at the stone above them and feeling, in the quiet that sometimes comes in the presence of very old and very large things, that the distance between then and now is perhaps not quite as large as it usually seems.